Hello, everyone. Welcome to this LinkedIn live session hosted by the FMCG guys with some great guests from Dunnhumby. On one side, we have Feroud, and then the other side, we have Siro. Thanks for joining us, guys.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Hello, thanks.
So the other day, I saw you guys posting, well, Siro specifically, posting about the new inflation report. So I thought it would be worth having you guys on to discuss what's happening with inflation and what consequences it can have for our industry. And also, by the way, joined by my dear co-host Efrain Rosario. Thanks for joining, Efrain, as well.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here with you.
Cool. So this will be, we're live now on LinkedIn, but this will also be recorded on video and audio, which we'll be sharing probably tomorrow. So whoever can't attend now can also listen to it on demand. And if you've liked the session, feel free to recommend it to your friends, colleagues, etc., that you think may benefit from listening to this. So let's go right into it. Maybe Siro, Feroud, whoever you like, you can tell us a bit about yourselves and Dunnhumby per se. Maybe we can start with yourselves. Whoever wants to start.
Okay, happy to start. So my name is Siro Descrovi. I'm a customer strategist for the EMEA region. Basically, my role is working with retailers across the region to basically help them really understand their customers and shape their strategy around to those needs. So basically, it's helping them creating customer strategy that can foster the growth for the business by really putting the customer at the center of what they do, at the center of their decisions. I've been in Dunnhumby for the last 8 years, covering different roles, working in the UK and then moving around a bit here and there according to different projects. And now I'm based in Rome.
Okay,
Fantastic.
I guess I'll go next.
Please do.
Thank you. So my name is Feroud. I work as a consumer psychologist within Dunnhumby, sitting within global market research. I've been at Dunnhumby for 4 years. I come from a kind of an academic behavioral science background, so I have the kind of PhD and MSc and all the rest of it. I'm quite a broad brush psychologist, I guess you can say. Within Dunnhumby, what I kind of have a grand vision of kind of uniting data science on one side with behavioral science on the other, with market research acting as a bridge between the two. My kind of vision is for the whole to be greater than the sum of those individual parts. So that's kind of what I'm bringing to the table, trying to get into the shoes, as it were, of the consumer out there. Siro, do you want to talk about Dunnhumby itself?
Yes, I can give you a little bit of a view. So Dunnhumby is a global leader in customer data science. And basically the concept is empowering business around the world to really understanding the customer needs and customers better. We believe that retailers, FMCGs, so all these companies can have really a role in society and can really have better performance if they engage and treat humans as individuals, not just as consumers, not just as a number on a KPI, but something more behind it. So what's the human side? What are the needs? And our story really is in a few numbers. Really, we can talk about 32 years of experience around the world, partnering with 78 retailers and over 1,200 CPGs. We are around 2,300 experts across the world in different offices. And basically, we look at over 18 billion of data on record. So this really helps us to get a really broad and very specific and granular view of what's going on in customer behaviors across the different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Dunnhumby is older than me, by the way. So 1 year older than me. By the way, to the audience, forgot to mention, if you have any questions to ask, any comments to make, please make them. I can look at them from here. And during the conversation and maybe at the end, we can do some Q&A if there's any Q to do.
Yeah.
Good.
So it's nice to be on with you guys. As somebody I've worked with Dunnhumby in my past, and have seen firsthand the power of the data that you all have available in terms of the millions of data points from real life shoppers in terms of what their actual purchase behavior is. So have greatly benefited from it. So it's nice to be with you all, and it's really interesting to hear, Feroud, you talk about this combination of behavioral science with data science and really bringing these worlds together. And I love the way you've expressed it in regards to really thinking about the human, the individual as a whole, as opposed to having a siloed view in terms of who consumer, shopper, because let's be honest. I mean, all that happens. The shift in mindset from consumption to shopping happens in an instant, right? In this new world of digital transformation. So we have to adapt with that as well. So it's really, really interesting to hear you all talk about it in that regard.
Absolutely.
And I kind of want to ask a question with a topic that's become very top of mind for a lot of people, a lot of companies, a lot of brands these days, which is the economy, right? And we've heard it expressed in a lot of different ways, depending on which media outlet you're talking to. Cost of living crisis, economic volatility, the dreaded R word, recession. But I'm curious to hear, and obviously the other one that kind of in essence is that common thread that runs through all those is inflation. And for our audience, and I think we can all use a refresher in this as well. Can you help us understand a little bit of like how would you explain inflation to a 5-year-old or to our grandmothers, if you will, in terms of like common terms? How would you actually explain inflation to someone?
I can pick this. So yes, it's a great question, because sometimes coming from an economic background, we heard about inflation, we give it for granted. We start with the assumption that everyone knows what we're talking about. But let's start with the fundamentals. Basically, inflation is a change in price. Basically, how the price of a particular product change year over year. And what really is behind the definition of inflation, I think is really important to understand and put in simple words why this is happening and what are the macro relationships that are going behind. So to explain that definition, I think we need to take a step back and see what happened in the last couple of years, take a broad perspective, and see how these things impacted the price of different things that we buy. So basically, on one side, we have too much money. Basically, we're coming from the 2008 recession and crisis with the central banks around the world with low interest rates, and therefore money was available. And with COVID coming in and the result of deepest GDP dropped, you have many central banks and government responding to really to help the customer and help the demand to stay there with other money in the market. So you have on one side a lot of money flowing in the world. On the other side, the other aspect is that we had too many goods, right? So if you remember during inflation, during COVID, customers changed dramatically their behavior. And because of the different policies that we see around the world, like lockdowns, restrictions in China, in Europe, and other countries, that impacted in a slowdown of production and also of logistics around the world. Therefore, you had this amount of money and customer willing to spend in a different way from before COVID, but still buy a lot of things. On the other side, too few goods, so some limitation in the production and in the supply around the world. And so these two things really were at the heart of the beginning of the inflation last year on the back of the COVID. And then the third element that played in is the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So another element, another disruptive element that came in, given the impact that it has on things like energy, raw food, think about the cereals and other elements. And this has been another variable that increased the impact on the inflation raised by COVID. So basically, long story short, we've seen this call it inflation, call it cost of living crisis, what really happens for customers, and we are feeling all around the world, is a sense that something has changed in the way they were receiving foods, receiving different resources, and this has impacted the prices of them.
And why did you guys, as Dunnhumby as a company, why did you decide to do this report?
Well, the idea is, and when we look at customers, so customers is our pinnacle point of the equation, right? So customer is our focus point. And then if you can visualize that, there is what customers will do. So it's a mix of attitude, behaviors, so what they think, feel, and do, which Feroud will help to go into the deep dive of those elements. And then, but these elements are influenced by what's going on in the world. What are the macro dynamics that really you can see through the news and really have an impact, conscious, unconscious, in how people behave. And basically, what we tried to do here with this report was trying to bring things in order, understand really what are the key variables that we need to track over time, understand what's the impact on customers' feelings, thinking, and behaviors, and also to understand what grocery retailers and FMCGs were doing to react, because we know that from a macro perspective, we can go into a more micro perspective, so understand how competition is fighting in this new environment, how customers are changing, and what are the key actions the retailers can do, and then eventually how they can use customer knowledge and data science to really understand these changes in order to react and plan what to do next.
So it's I think you hit the nail on the head, Siro, in terms of thinking about not just what consumers are feeling, but I think ultimately how that translates into their coping behaviors, and then ultimately what retailers and brands are doing either in response or in anticipation of some of these things. Because I can tell you that my experience has been that that's the questions that we're getting in terms of from our senior leadership around uh, it's that understanding of both sides, right? So it's not just the sentiment, but ultimately, what is the consumer response going to be? But starting, I guess, from the taking one step back from that, I'd love to understand um, what are you all seeing in regards to this through this research around the current macroeconomic environment? Like, what is the current global view of this, and from a macroeconomic standpoint?
Well, there are, so if we read the news, there's been many different messages out there. And however, if I have to really simplify those points, the relation is this one. So we're going through one of the major inflation that's been quiet in a while. So if you look at the data in the US, we hit a 40 years high this year. So we're talking about something that our generation haven't seen, right? So we aren't used to deal with inflation. So that's the main thing to keep in mind. Also because we were coming out from a situation of 2 years that was really thinking about how do we grow, how do we foster our spend, how do we keep customers okay with what's going on under the COVID umbrella. So there was this, everyone was looking at that. No one really was thinking about inflation, and no one has been working on inflation for quite a while. So I think this is the first really important element here to consider. In terms of macroeconomics element, there are two things here to consider, and I think this is very important to start understanding how inflation can evolve over time. So one element is the impact of COVID, as we said, so the shortage of key components of our daily life. Think about microchips in China. Think about food that didn't really think about other elements that weren't able to find in the last year. Therefore, these elements impacted a lot the normal economy and the normal production of goods. But this is something that, as we start seeing with some indexes like the Freight Transportation Index, these are things that are starting to unlocking around the world. So there is a little bit of an ease around those first macro factor. However, there is a second one, which is the one that is connected to the conflict of Ukraine and Russia. And here the situation is slightly different. We are really connected to the news to see what's going on with them in this conflict, and we need to understand what's the impact of this conflict on the economics. So I think there are two levels that we can actually see this impact. The first one is a direct impact. So questions like who are those countries will be connected to supplies from Russia and Ukraine across different raw materials like energy, like gas, like cereals, like fertilizants or other elements. And the second one is the impact across the entire economy, because if you cannot provide these elements through your normal channel, you're going to grow in another channel, and therefore this will impact the price of the other countries. Yeah. And for this element, I think it's a different one. It's more, we need to see how the progression of the conflict goes and what are the different accords that they can take.
Yeah, one quick point to add to that, which I think is interesting when we look at this on a global basis, is that you're absolutely right. People in countries like the US and in the UK, this is the first time that we've ever experienced these levels of inflation. That being said, if you talk to people in some markets like in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia, as I like to say, this isn't their first rodeo. They've been through this before in terms of hyperinflation. So I think for brands and retailers who are operating on a multinational or a global basis, it might be interesting to consider thinking about what learnings can I import from some of these other markets who have been through these kinds of inflationary times in terms, but apply those in, let's say, what we consider more emerging markets, apply those learnings into some of our developed markets as well in regards to understanding how consumers react to that. And in Europe, what I've seen from my experience has been that Turkey was in essence a bit of a almost like the canary in the coal mine, if you will, in regards to from a European or pan-European standpoint, was one of the markets that started to see inflation earlier than some of the other markets.
And another element that I think is worth noting as well is that we normally link a recession, well, we're talking about inflation here, but one of the elements of potential recession to labor, to like job loss, right? And on the contrary, right now we're in a moment of like labor shortage. So there's just all these moving pieces that make this moment obviously complex, but also fascinating at the same time, right?
Yeah, essentially, it's a very fluid situation out there, and whereas there are similarities to the past, there are also differences when compared to the past.
Yeah, another element that I think is worth considering this conversation, because as I said, Daniel, I think I really like this webinar because we're going to bring different perspective to this topic, and I think is additive. Another element that it's the saving ratio of customers during COVID, right? So we've seen some European figures about how people during COVID were able to save most of the time, so spend less compared to the past. Of course, there is a discrimination about different kind of people's job and activities, so we need to be very careful with this data. But if you look at the average, well, that tells halfway through most of the time. There is this element that probably at the beginning of inflation have helped and soften the impact of inflation on sales growth and volume growth. Therefore, from my perspective, I believe we still need to face the hardest point on terms of consumer spending, because there's been some buffer I would call it from COVID time, that companies can have access to in these few months, actually almost a year now. But then now, when the savings are going to end, what's going to happen? That's my question, basically.
Yeah. Well, scary. Over to you guys again, and more probably going deeper into the report that you guys at Dunnhumby have made. How have consumers reacted to this complex moment that we are in, which, recession or not, what we definitely have is inflation. And how have consumers reacted to this inflationary environment?
I guess I'll come in here, Siro, if that's okay. So at Dunnhumby, we run a set of reports called the Consumer Pulse Reports. They started off back in the COVID days, essentially, where we're trying to understand how COVID was affecting the attitudes and behaviors of our consumers out there. Clearly, COVID isn't really at the center stage at this point in time, and the cost of living crisis clearly is. So what I do within these Consumer Pulse reports, which is essentially a survey-based methodology, where I compare what's happening now to last year. So essentially kind of a pre-inflation compared to a post-inflation wave. We do this in 25 different markets around the world. So we do cover LATAM, North America, APAC, but the bulk of the countries sit within EMEA region. And by EMEA region, I'm talking of Western and Central Europe, as well as Scandinavia, Middle East and Africa as well. So it's quite a broad brush. It covers a lot of different markets around the world. And I'm afraid, kind of jumping on this kind of bleak perspective that Siro has given from a macroeconomic point of view, we see something similar when you put the shoes of the consumer on as well. So I'm just going to kind of throw out some numbers that I've caught in this report that we have. When we ask consumers out there, to what extent do they perceive their economy in their nation to be weak, 75% say that their economy is weak. It's pretty hard-hitting numbers. When I asked the same question about their personal finances, that isn't quite as bad. It's 57% of respondents out there said that their personal finances are weak. I'm just going to take a pause, because essentially what it seems is as if when consumers look outside of their windows, what they see in their economy out there is somewhat worse than what they see with regards to their own personal finances. It kind of indicates to me there's a bit of a buffer zone there, and I hope that buffer zone stays there, or in fact gets bigger. But I'm going to point out a note of optimism where I can. I think it's important in these bleak times. But let me go back a step. When we ask consumers out there, to what extent do you recognize food prices have increased? Over 9 in 10 say they recognize food prices have gone up. So the vast majority of consumers out there know exactly what's happening. Now, one of the things I like to do, and this is kind of covering the consumer psychology angle, I don't just like to reiterate the levels of inflation or the levels of specifically food inflation. I actually ask consumers out there, what do they think the level of perceived food inflation is? And I kind of like to contrast the two together, the perceived inflation versus the actual inflation. When we submitted this survey out, and this is data from September of this year, the perceived rate of food inflation was double that of the actual food inflation rate, double. So that's pretty startling. However, when we asked the same question earlier this year in February, the difference between perceived food inflation versus actual food inflation was 4 times. In other words, over the course of the year, it would seem, and I'm perhaps in danger of stretching the data beyond itself, but I don't mind sticking my neck out when I think it's pointing in the right direction. It would seem as if the difference between perceived food inflation and actual food inflation is getting closer together over time. And I think that's simply because over the course of the year, during this inflationary period, consumers have had time to kind of adjust themselves to reflect and to understand what inflation is and what its impact it's having on them. In other words, maybe, just maybe, in the same way you can say that consumers have learned to live with COVID, consumers are learning to live with inflation. I'd be curious to see how those figures come out across next year when we're going to be doing these sets of studies again. There's quite a big difference when you look around the world with regards to food inflation. So perceived food inflation can be quite high. Some countries almost touching on 50%, like Hungary or Latin America. It can, on the right, on the other side, go right down in places like Japan or Finland and France, where it's nearer the mid-teens, let's say. So there's quite a lot of variation going on around the world. And I think this draws an important point because many FMCGs and retailers are global players. But it may imply that what you do in one market shouldn't just be copy and pasted in a different market. You've got to be aware of the regional differences, and these may be commercial and logistical differences, but it could also come across in the cultural differences across different markets as well. And I think you've got to be very careful of what you implement in different parts of the world. Yes, take learnings from them, but also be aware of the differences as well.
Yeah. I would say to that, I think that, yeah, totally agree. I think that, like you said, both culturally as well as commercially, I think there's just a lot of variance across the different markets. And I think in addition to the research you're citing as well, I think I've seen other reports that have said that you have to really understand some of those nuances pretty well in regards to, for example, consumer sentiment. There's a wide swath with regards to, if you look at that number for a market like the UK or Germany versus some of the Latin markets, there's a wide variance in regards to the level of optimism that consumers have in those two different sets of markets.
Completely agree.
And that's ultimately then reflecting in regards to how are they coping with the economic situation, right? So it could be in terms of, like you're saying, how they perceive that, the perceived versus the actual inflation figures. It could also mean in regards to the consumer response, what it's been in terms of, for example, are they trading down? Are they looking at new channels in terms of where they're purchasing? Are they actively seeking sales or offers in certain places as well? So I think you're absolutely right. I think understanding the nuances across the markets is really critically important.
I think sorry,
Which,
Daniel,
by the way, we have Peter Bond, which I know has joined us. Hi, Peter. He's joining us from the US. And just to double check, the people that have been interviewed for this survey, is it the global survey?
The results I'm citing are from the global survey.
Okay.
So that's 25 different markets from around the world. I kind of made mention of various regions, but they're mainly from the EMEA region. But yes, we do have reports specifically to, say, the US, if you're interested in those reports.
Got it. Yeah, just to remind the audience, if anyone joined late, we're talking everything about inflation and its impact on the FMCG industry with Feroud and Siro from Dunnhumby. Feroud, we were talking about how the consumer reaction to this. You've thrown some very interesting numbers here. Like 9 out of 10 people have actually recognized the prices have gone up. So that means virtually everyone. What else is there?
Yeah, so I think Efrain was making reference to, what are the actual impacts that this is having on consumers in terms of their behaviors. And I'll give you another few snippets here. So it would seem, when I asked the question, are consumers visiting the same store? When you look across this year to last year, they're not. In other words, loyalty is going down. So retailers are going to have to kind of fight for the loyalty of their consumers more so than they have been in the past, I dare say. Also, if loyalty going down isn't tough enough for retailers and FMCGs out there, the number of shopping trips is also trending downwards as well. So it's kind of a bit of a double whammy. I'm particularly interested in what I refer to as value-seeking strategies out there and what consumers are doing to kind of improve on value, because clearly with cost of living crisis, value is of utmost importance. Usual snippets I am finding out there. So, for example, the number of consumers who are searching online to find their best sales has increased 10% year on year. 10% is quite a meaty number, as you can imagine. And also the numbers of consumers who are using coupons on products that they buy regularly, that has also increased by 10% year on year. But I'm not so interested in those perhaps more obvious points, if you don't mind me saying so. I'm also interested in those value-seeking strategies, or what would typically be viewed as a value-seeking strategy that is actually trending downwards or maybe even static. Because what I mean by this is what value seeking means to your consumers changes over time. What do I mean by this? So when I look at our data, the numbers of consumers who are purchasing larger size packs is going down. In the long term, it makes sense to buy a larger size pack, but at this point in time, with inflation being the way it is, that's not what consumers are doing. They're looking to reduce their budgets in the short term, and they're not as focused on the long term at this point in time. So I find that an interesting point. Another interesting point that I like to make mention of is there seems to be a lesser number of consumers who are creating a shopping list before they go out to do their grocery shopping. Now, why is that? Well, put that together with some of the stats that I made mention of earlier, like decreased loyalty. It may imply that what consumers are doing is they're walking into more stores than they would normally do, and they're looking for what's on promotion more than they would normally do. So that the value of creating a plan before you shop may not be as worthwhile from the consumer's point of view as it once was in perhaps more normal times.
It's interesting because I could envision where you said like those value seeking strategies will vary based on the socioeconomic level of the consumer, right? So I think we're talking, if you're talking to higher income versus lower income consumers, their resilience is obviously
Yes.
going to vary, and I think obviously their strategies will vary as well, right? So
Yes,
in
that's
some
true.
cases they'll be more or less likely to be able to rationalize some of their choices as well. And I think by category, at least one interesting piece of research that I had seen as well was that if you're talking about essential categories versus discretionary categories, consumers' ability or uh, openness to be able to rationalize, being
Mhm.
able to still buy their brand of choice will vary as well. Because I think that the stat that I seen was that 58% of consumers still feel that being able to treat myself is essential to getting through some of the hard times. So I think
Yes.
you're making choices in regards to where you choose to, um, in essence, change your purchase habit versus others, depending on the category and how important it is to you, or how important it is in terms of that moment of reward.
Yeah, and I think that's an important segue to talk about treats and the like. I mean, there's quite a bleak picture out there when you think of what consumers have walked through. They've gone through COVID, they've seen panic buying, they're going through inflation, and now the threat of recession. One of the things I try to do is to see, what's the opportunity for FMCG and retailers out there. And I think what you pointed at is extremely important. That if you think about the well-being of consumers out there, it's no wonder they want to treat themselves. And I explicitly asked the question, to what extent do you occasionally treat yourself? And the answer, depending on which market you're looking at, range between 25% to 50% of consumers do treat themselves. And I think that's an extremely important point given the context that we're dealing with. So in other words, bear in mind that these are the same consumers that say they recognize food prices have gone up. They are the same consumers that tell us that perceived food inflation is double that of actual food inflation. And despite that, they still need to treat themselves. And I think that highlights an important opportunity for FMCG and retailers out there. This originally stemmed from, I kind of often make reference to the academic literature as well. And sometimes the academic literature will make mention of something called the lipstick effect. So if you look at recessions in the past, I think it started off in the dot-com bubble and also in the Great Recession. Apparently women reduced some of their spend on clothing, but in order to treat themselves, they still bought a high-end premium lipstick or cosmetic. And that's simply because people need to feel special still. People still need to treat themselves. They still want to kind of decrease their stresses and strains. So if whether it's merely an economic slowdown or whether we do go on to a full-on global recession, there are still opportunities out there. And I think FMCGs and retailers need to think, how can we decrease the stresses and strains on our consumers out there?
Yeah.
Bear in mind
So
Yep, carry on.
No. Go ahead, Feroud. Go ahead, please.
Think in what happens in other economic slowdowns. People may spend more time at home, for example. They're going out less. They're going out to restaurants less, and that's something that was also uncovered in this piece of research. So people are going out to restaurants less, and they are cooking from scratch at home more. There is another opportunity. What can retailers and FMCGs do to kind of reproduce that restaurant-like experience in the comfort of their own homes? What can FMCGs and retailers do to decrease the stress of consumers? So think not just of the obvious things like confectionery or beers, wines, and spirits, or other kind of premium foods out there that you could purchase. It could also relate to areas like personal care. There's other academic research that suggests, when you go for your shower or bath, whichever you prefer, it actually decreases your stress levels. So trying to make those everyday routines more pleasurable is an opportunity for us, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard it referred to as elevating the experience, right? Through and I'm also familiar with the lipstick effect um, terminology. I've also heard it referenced as affordable luxuries as well
Yes,
in regards to
yes.
we need some of those things. So for Siro, you mentioned you've referenced a couple of the ways that retailers and FMCGs have started to or could possibly start to react. I'm curious to hear if there's any more specific tactics that you're seeing in regards to retailers and their response to some of this shifting or evolving consumer habits in terms of what are they seeing? What are some of the things that you're seeing and some of the things you're seeing work well?
Oh, we've lost you, Siro.
Did you lost me?
Yep, you're
No,
back.
you're back.
Good. Fine. Fantastic. Thanks. Yes, as part of the research behind this report that we shared, we've done some work to understand with the different leads in the different market where we operate, what are the key things they emerging working with retailers day to day, because that's where, by being there, by working in the field, we're working really, really hard to get this concept, to landing these concepts into a retail store. It's important to understand what are the driving aspect of that and the key solutions. So overall, we highlighted 6 different opportunities, 6 different tactics that retailers can do. And I believe before we jump into those, they are all kind of connected to the idea of value perception. And I really think, as Feroud was mentioning before, that there is this idea of localization of value definition. So how customers define the value equation different is very different. It's very different between across countries and even in the same country between different years. We developed different research around the world called RPIs, where we stress this idea of what's really driving the value perception of a customer when it comes to buying grocery. And we see that these variables are changing over time, but also changing over countries. And this year, we have really seen an important element of price perception. We see a really emerging role of a strengthening role of private brands. And also the role of promotion and space. So starting from this point, so basically these measures are good, but it's not one size fits all. It's almost understanding really what's the dynamic of the market, what's the customers' attributes that you want to work on, and then define what's the right approach. But what we've seen working so far is that the first thing that we've seen really impacting is delivering value to price-sensitive customers. That means really create a good refresh and create a segmentation that really highlight who are your most price-sensitive customers, because these are those customers where the change in price will have the highest effect in terms of change behaviors. So they will be the one that recognize the most the price and will be the one that will change their behavior the most according to this price increase. So the first element is that one. So recognize who these customers are, what are the features, where they live, what's the typical stores, all this kind of descriptive analysis. A second element that we saw very powerful is once we understand what these customers are, defining what we call the KVIs. So KVIs as known value items. So basically understand which are the products that have a very meaningful effect for the value perception of a particular grocery retailer. So if you to bring it to life, you see many examples of communication from retailers around the world saying, we fix the price of these 100 products, 500 products, 1,000 products. A list that goes on and on and on. But the way you choose those products, the science you put behind those products, these are really key element for a winning strategy or a different not winning strategy. Basically, being able to identify those products is a key element. Therefore, we saw that when we were able to really identify those customers and lowering and fixing down the price to those customers will recognize more, and therefore you have a really better effect rather than lowering price on random items or items that sell the most or they're not really important for these customers. That's the one. The second one is more about driving private brands. So a lot of retailers are, especially those retailers that they haven't really paid a lot of attention to private brands in the last few years, they start recognizing the importance in the market, and therefore they started to coming back and revisit their strategy. We see two cases here. From one side, we have retailers where there's been a proliferation of private brands in the course of time to follow different opportunities of the categories. And now they're calling for reduction, a more pointed offer that they can call out the value perception and proposition in the market. And the second one is more about opportunity to grow the private brand, given that most of the time can have had for some retailers a more instrumental roles rather than a strategic roles for differentiating. Then when it comes down to other levers that retailer can use, we see promotions. Of course, as Feroud was saying, a lot of customers are going through different stores with other lists, trying to see what are the promotions there and find the right one for them. Here, the work that we've been doing with a few retailers and we believe is really, really important is to reduce the complexity of promotion, right? So promotion is usually the like-for-like battle, the like-for-like excessiveness. You're always trying to fight yourself, to fight the market, to beat the market. I've seen many cases on promotions that retailers were doing that just because we done it last year, or our competitor is going to do it in a month. Right.
I would say too, I remember we used to say at another FMCG that I worked at, consumers don't like to do complex math when they're shopping.
Correct.
So if you're asking them to do calculus to figure out if they're actually getting a deal, not going to work.
No. And in fact, here on the promotion stream, I would say there are two things really that I really like to mention. The first one is really understand where a retailer can cut promotions, right? So the idea here is simplify to amplify. Okay, simplify the complexity of promotion in store to really create good deals that are important for customers. At the same time, you mentioned, Efrain, the way you communicate these promotions needs to be simple, needs to be easy. Customer in these periods of time, they need to trust you as a partner. So retailers don't have to be a transitional point where you go and just buy grocery and you go home. It needs to be a place where you go and feel safe. You feel safe that you can do the right choice for you and your family to get over these difficult times. If you go there and you feel that someone is taking advantage from you, someone is taking advantage of your situation, you're looking for, is trying to sell you more, these things now, they don't really work. They haven't really worked in the past, now less than ever, because really customers are looking for that trust in a retailer.
Yeah, and I would also say that I think it's about relevance of the promotion and offer,
correct.
right? So as opposed to blanketing the entire population of shoppers that you may be going after with the same promotion, I think it's making it very targeted, very personalized in a way, or as personalized as you can in regards to, is this relevant for that shopper typology versus this shopper typology where a different offer might be more relevant.
Yeah, definitely. And if you go down, that's you almost call out another of the tactics at work, which is basically helping customers find value. And the best way to help them find the right value for them is to create promotions right for them, right? So I've always the example: if I don't drink alcohol or if I don't have a baby, uh, I don't care about alcoholic promotions or diapers promotions, right? So I care if I receive in my newsletter, if I see in my local store promotion that really speak to me, right? So if I live in a city, I want to see quick, easy food on promotion and not particular things that I'm not able to carry at home. So these are all the mechanisms that they really plays a role and they really leverage the customer knowledge the retailers have. So the more you know your customers, the more you know. It's almost like we. The idea for me is that we need to. Our ambition here is really to recreate in a big scale what was going on in the past in the small stores, where the different store owners knew exactly the customers one by one, and they were able to offer them the right products at the right price with the right promotions for them. So we lost that in for scale, for other things, but now we can really use leverage data to require to gather back that knowledge in order to influence how we operate in the market.
And within this environment, and maybe quickly, because I see that where time is flying, maybe quickly, how would you recommend that FMCG brands, because a lot of our audience is FMCG, how can they maximize this environment, this opportunity right now?
I can start, and through feel free to jump in with some of the points from the stats. I think from a FMCG perspectives, there are a few things to consider. The first one, given the FMCGs, I tend to think of their environment as the category they operate in, or the need states, the customer need states they try to solve. So the idea is to understand what's their role in that category, understand what's the percentage of price sensitive customer are buying those products, understand if they have the right brand architecture and the right product architecture to really give to different customers the different solutions that they're looking for. So as we spoke at the beginning, we've seen basically two variables moving here, right? So one is the different segment of customers, and the other one is the different needs that they have. And between these two variables, we can see a lot of variance across where I want to save and where I want to treat myself. So I think FMCGs need to really understand the role of their brand in the categories and with the customers, the most loyal customers, even more, and then articulate and develop the right offer, the right value proposition in order to really meet these needs.
That's great stuff, Siro. You've kind of given a very focused answer. I think what I'll do is to kind of pan back a little bit more. And, whilst it's important to kind of gain an understanding of the kind of macroeconomic climate, which Siro has nicely illustrated for us today, whilst it's important to also try to get yourselves into the shoes of the consumer, the market research side of the coin, it's also important to emphasize the transactional data, but also the kind of generic trends that are going on out there. The more you can kind of connect these various dots and get a 360 view of your consumer, I think that should better inform your customer strategy going forward. And that's what I would recommend to FMCGs out there.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's depending on where you're talking or who you're talking with, that can be referenced in a lot of different ways: omni-channel, omni-commerce, convergent commerce, you name it. But I think you're absolutely right. I think having that holistic 360-degree view across your channels, across your trade formats, is super, super critical. And it's only going to get more important as the toggling back and forth becomes just easier and more seamless, if you will. I had one last question. As Daniel mentioned, time has flown, and I think we've covered a lot of really rich content, and you've given us a couple of really killer facts from.
Sorry, 1 second. I need to go to the door, but please continue without me. I'll be back in a minute. Sorry.
Sure. So, quick a speed round discussion to kind of help wrap up our conversation was what do we see is next on the horizon, right? So I'm asking each of us to kind of look into our crystal ball and say, if I'm thinking 6, 12 months out from now, what's the situation going to be? Are we what do we think? And obviously I know that there's a lot of challenges with prognosticating and trying to predict the future, but I'm curious to hear your perspective in regards to how do you see the next 12 months playing out from a retail and FMCG standpoint?
You want me? I can start. So this is where we stop recording, right? Because
well, yeah. Or
yeah.
we put a strong disclaimer being saying,
yes,
that this
this
is none of us are no actually no one is really an expert future predictor.
It's really hard. It's hardest that it's never been, because we've seen so many changes in the last few years that even historical data is not really useful to predict the future, right? So a lot of can be, but you need to be careful because the classic module, the classic elements, they don't really show you the long term, basically, of that. So it's a step-by-step approach, I think, that we need to take here. However, said that, I tried to put together a few ideas of what's next. And the first one for me is the focus, right? So where retailers and FMCG should start focusing more. And I think it's to prepare for economic slowdown, prepare for that, whilst we're seeing the inflation that have started to ease somewhere. So we've seen the recent data from the US where different analysts are calling for the peak to be passed. We've seen different central banks taking measure on that. However, I think there is this gap between what's going on in the economics and the customer's perception and the customer's feeling and behaviors that probably Feroud can expand more. But basically, there's an element here that we see consumers and business confidence keeps falling. So we still need to hold on in this trajectory, but at the same time, start thinking ahead in terms of what's next. What can I do in order to, for example, make my business more efficient? What can I do to reshape my proposition, my offering for customers in a time where probably they're going to be less splurged around categories of which are those categories where I can admit more. And yes, so these are the top things that I have in mind.
I think what I'd like to just highlight, and we've talked about, making reference to the past, but as I think I said earlier in this podcast, it's important to look at the differences going into the next year as well. And the main difference, as far as I can see, is the cost of energy. So, to come home and to cook from scratch is going to cost a lot more than it normally would. And I suspect that will affect consumer behaviors out there. So yes, then they may not visit restaurants or particularly high-end restaurants as much, but I do wonder, are consumers going to be changing their habits and use other modes of cooking more? For example, are they going to use the microwave more compared to, say, their oven? Are we going to see an increase in ready meals and the like? There's a kind of an interest. Sorry, I realize we're running out of time. I'll just give this quick snippet and then I'll end there. People are working from home more as well. And to what extent is that going to provide an opportunity for at-home meals? So I do see opportunities. The one snippet that I'd like to make reference to is that the UK is a very pub-orientated culture, and some pubs in the UK have, rather than work from home, you can treat yourself to a work from pub instead. So for a fixed fee, you can get your hot beverages at lunch and a quick drink after your working day. And I just think these are going to be important albeit minor trends that may crop up over the course of the year as consumers are trying to cut costs and trying to make things interesting at the same time.
Yeah, good initiative. Good initiative. It would be a bit dangerous for me personally to work from a pub, but it sounds like a good idea. Maybe I don't know if our audience have any questions. If you do, we can try to answer a couple of questions quickly. Feroud and Siro, is this report already available so we can make it available through our website and podcast notes once we post it?
Yes, it is. It is available, and yes, we can share the link, so you can share that.
That would be
Federico
great.
Pietrini, good person that I know for a long time, says work from a pub is a brilliant idea here in London. He's Italian but based in London, so there you go.
That's good to hear.
Listen,
Yeah,
I think the blurring of these kinds of things is happening all the time. I was talking to somebody and they said that there's a nail salon that they go to where you can actually go and have a cocktail as well. So I don't know how you do that if you're having your nails worked on, but maybe it's one hand on, one hand off type of thing.
It's a
But
straw.
very interesting as well.
Yeah, not a bad idea either. Hey, well, guys, thanks a lot for joining us, Efrain and I, for this session. I think it was super interesting. And as mentioned, I'll share this on the podcast. We have a YouTube platform now as well, so we'll probably share it there so people can watch it on demand. And probably see you soon for another review of some report that Dunnhumby does. I think it would be a good idea to do this continuously.
Definitely. Thanks for having us. Really good conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel and Efrain. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure is ours.